Hello and welcome to Press TV's Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, across the board, from white-collar workers to blue-collar workers, few seem satisfied with their jobs in the United Kingdom. From railway drivers to ambulance driver to lawyers and doctors, just about everyone is demanding better working conditions and an increase in their salaries. Industrial strikes have become common, but few have had desired results. What's going on in the UK and what is next for the British people? Well, to help me look at all of this, I'd like to welcome my guest to the program. Out of Amsterdam, Steve Keen, economist and author. And Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol. Well, good to have both of you with me on the program. Let's start off with Steve. Steve, why are we seeing such dissatisfaction across the board with workers in the UK?
I think because the UK has had about 20 to 25 years, actually longer, 40 years, of failed economic and industrial policies with an obsession upon government austerity, and also a belief that manufacturing is not a growth area, so they decided to specialise in services. They're empirically completely wrong. Services have never replaced the manufacturing exports Britain used to make, so it's now running chronic trade deficits while the government tries not to spend money, and that is a recipe for a declining amount of money in the economy and a declining amount of jobs. And finally, the working class and middle class, and that includes doctors in the UK, given its national health scheme, are finally saying they've had enough and they're demanding some sort of compensation for the effective cut in their real incomes over the last 30 or 40 years.
Well, Tony, would you say that this all started off around the time of Margaret Thatcher, or your assessment of it all?
Very
well,
much
look,
so.
definitely. Steve's absolutely right. 45 years ago, with the advent of Thatcher, she was selling off the family silver. That's what we called it here, and that is the all of the public sector works that have been put in really since the 1930s. And this was the way that the governments, both here and in the United States and other parts of the world, built their way out of the Great Depression, was to spend money, public money, on building infrastructure for the country. And Margaret Thatcher started then selling all of that off. But we've got a big difference going on in the public and the private sector and what's left of the public sector, because that is to say things like hospitals, because that's all in the public sector here in Britain with the National Health Service, just simply hasn't been keeping pace with the private sector. Private sector pay is kind of managing to keep up with inflation, but public sector pay has gone right back, and this is why there's been so much. And of course, at the same time, we've now got Andrew Bailey, the new governor of the Bank of England, is starting to ramp up interest rates. So this is causing even more stress on people's disposable income, particularly, as I just said, for the people in the public sector. This is, rail workers, which is essentially, although it's been partly privatised, it's a government-owned network, and they can do what they want with it effectively, as well as also the teachers. And now we've seen the junior doctors are simply not able to keep up because their rents and their mortgages are now starting to go up. So their pay is going down. So even the pay awards that they have got in the public sector, the teachers have accepted it, and the nurses, etc., is actually a pay cut. This is, as Steve says, a complete failure of economics, really, and of course aided and abetted by this particular government under Rishi Sunak, who really seems to act rather more in the interests of his old bosses at Goldman Sachs than he does in the voters here. Of course, the British voters never voted for him. They voted for Boris. Boris was shunted out of the way, and Goldman Sachs were brought in to take over.
Well, Steve, when we look at the situation, Tony just talked about junior doctors. We have senior doctors that are going on strike in a few more days. It just seems in general that things are in disarray. I mean, when we look at, especially, let's look at physicians. and the importance, of course, of their job. And looking at the situation in the UK, one would think that there would be certain professions that at least the government would look at a little bit closer in trying to, for example, right now, especially after the COVID crisis, the nurses and the doctors gave so much of their time, and actually the government thanked them and said what a great job they have done. But at the end of the day, why isn't anything done for the people?
Largely because of the obsession about running government surpluses, which is, it sounds sensible to most people. Most people think you shouldn't spend more than you earn, but that's applying a household way of thinking to a government, where a government actually creates money, and it creates money by spending more than it gets back in taxation. So if you have an obsession with running a surplus instead, and that's dominated British politics for the last 40 years, and certainly the last 15 under the recent bunch of Tories, you're actually destroying money and then telling people the economy to grow faster. And the trouble is, unfortunately, the easiest way for the government to not create money is to pay lousy wages to its workers in nationally owned industries. And of course, in the UK, health is nationally owned. So they find it easier to clap and applaud than pay money, when in fact they should do both. And if they did do both, they'd create more money for the private sector, which might enable economic activity in the UK to get off the floor.
Well, Tony, how much of this goes back to a neoliberal agenda? Because if we look at, again, I go back to Thatcher, or of course in the States it was Reagan at the same time, and we see from then on just a drop in the quality of the lives of workers, and as far as benefits and payments. Your take on that, the role in neoliberalism in this?
Look, it's massively important. You're absolutely right. Look, even the Royal Society for Medicine in 2011 came out with a very comprehensive report, which had taken it 2 years to put together, looking at all of the healthcare systems right across the OECD countries, and particularly Europe and the United States. And they found that the British National Health Service was the most cost effective, the best value, and that's because the profit motive is taken out of the system in a public sector like the National Health Service, which is free at the point of delivery. So this is an extremely effective and extremely efficient, cost effective, very good value health service we've got. Now, who doesn't like that? Let's have a think. Oh, I tell you who it is. It's the American private health insurance companies, which is an extremely inefficient way and highly expensive way to run a healthcare system. And so they've been eating away, and this is part of neoliberal economics. And let me tell you why it is the doctors have actually gone out on strike finally, after many years of having their pay eroded. And that's because they're looking around them and seeing the doctors, their colleagues, actually just leaving because the pay is so low. These people can go to almost any country abroad and get paid more as a doctor than they can here in Britain. And so they're not doing this for selfish reasons. In other words, they want more money. What they're doing is they're saying, well, unless we go on strike now, there's going to be nothing left of this health service. And indeed, we've seen the figures for waiting lists, waiting times in Britain escalate over the period of COVID. Obviously, they went up, but they've just never come down. They've been continuing to go up since then, and we're now at roughly 1 in 10 people in Britain is waiting for a important, possibly life-saving operation, and the waiting list is now up to over 7.5 million people now waiting for an operation, waiting for a procedure, because there simply aren't enough doctors, because the health service is hemorrhaging this staff. Now, of course, this is a tactic of neoliberal economics, as I'm sure Steve will agree. You've got to destroy the opposition, however good it is, otherwise you can't get your high profit motive healthcare system into the country.
Well, Steve, does it make a difference, the British government, if Labour is in power or the Conservatives are in power? You've been talking about, and Tony, been talking about 40 years. So in 40 years, we've had governments from Labour, we've had them from both parties. Does it make a difference at the end of the day who is actually in power?
It does make a small difference, because the way I describe it is the Tories impose neoliberalism with glee, and the Labor Party imposes neoliberalism with an apology, and is therefore likely to be less extreme in how much it cuts back pay and cuts back services and so on, but it still fundamentally wears the same hat. This, of course, is the Labor Party under Keir Starmer, and the Labor Party is created by Tony Blair rather than the Labor Party as it was in the old days and as Corbyn tried to make it when he was the leader. So if you share the same ideology, you're going to come out with the same sorts of policies. And it's the ideology which is to blame. And it really is an incompatible ideology to Labor thinking overall. The Labor Party has conned itself to believe this ideology. The Tories believe it because it suits them. It still doesn't make the theory any better, but they at least, in a weird way, benefit out of the sort of catastrophes that they've imposed upon the public sector in the UK.
Well, Tony, let's talk about the social aspects of this, because the Brits are not the French. I mean, they do not usually protest or demonstrate or even industrial action a lot. Very different. I mean, we look at, I can tell you, being an American, I remember looking at the UK with envy. For example, the higher education at one point in time was free over there that we could not have even imagined in the States. Of course, that was taken away from you guys, and not a whole lot was done. So I want to talk about this part right now, that actually more and more people are taking these industrial actions. For the British, let's talk about that side of things, what it means.
Well, I think in a way the British have got a sort of reserved anarchistic streak in them. People are very independent minded and they would rather not act, but when they are pushed, and this is one of the things that's so fascinating about the politics here at the moment, is we've got an opposition Labour Party and Keir Starmer, who's part of the Rockefeller Trilateral Commission, which he joined secretly when he was in Jeremy Corbyn's cabinet, by the way. And so what you've got effectively is just Team A and Team B of the same party now. Corbyn was very different. And so we have no real opposition in Parliament. But what we do have is we still have democratic unions. And all of these unions take all these decisions by asking their members at ballots what they want to do. And so that's why I think we've seen the unions kind of replace the Labour Party as a political opposition here in the UK, because they're actually the only section of democratic politics left that actually acts in a democratic fashion. So the leadership is following what the membership wants. So when an offer comes along, the leadership of the union will put that to all its members, and the members will decide when it's potentially going to go out on strike or take industrial action of another sort. This goes out to a ballot. The members decide. And so that's, I think, what one of the most fascinating things about politics here now is the way that the Parliament, the mother of parliaments, is in this stranglehold of neoliberal economics on both sides with Team A and Team B. But it's actually the members of the trade unions outside that are now trying to save the public services they work in. As I said, hemorrhaging staff. It's the only way they can actually stop the teaching professions collapse. I mean, we've got in our universities, you were just talking about, a horrible situation where only the people like Amazon and big business can afford to pay for departments and chairs at universities. So the universities are now becoming almost like public relations operations and think tanks for big corporations. They've got very little freedom, academic freedom now. And we've seen various academics literally kicked out of their jobs because they're saying something which upsets the corporate funders of a university. So, you know, you're right. It was a fantastic system here with free higher education about 40 years ago, 30 years ago, in fact. But we're now seeing the corporate takeover of almost everything, even the corporate lobbying of government becoming so powerful that these big corporations can lobby the government. And what we see is a decimation of small and medium businesses with COVID, and also with these increased interest rates and rents and this sort of thing. The small and medium businesses are going bust at an incredible rate. Public houses, pubs being shut, a lot of public spaces going over to housing. And this benefits those big corporations, the Amazons, the Microsofts, these big multinationals, because they're so much more powerful at lobbying our government, which is extremely weak.
Well, Steve, why does it seem that there's always money, for example, for war, or we see now how much money London has been giving to Ukraine? I mean, it seems like everything else is prioritized over the British people. Your take on that?
It's Though that's true. I mean, the usual mantra, how are we going to pay for it, has never applied to buying weapons or sending troops overseas. That's taken on as a duty, something we must do. Of course, the UK has made appalling choices of where it does that over the last 30 or 40 years. But it seems when national security is mentioned, all concepts of budgetary responsibility, so-called, go out the window. In fact, the best security is a healthy society. And that's what's being undermined by all these policies. So again, it's ideology ruling over logic.
So where do you see that going, Tony? You heard what Steve said, that security actually comes about with a society that is more satisfied. Your take on where the UK is going, do you see the situation improving?
Well, no, I don't, because I had a chat to Crispin Flintoff, who he was one of the biggest fundraisers for Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in the whole, actually one of the biggest fundraisers in the whole of the Labour Party's history. And chatting with him as I interviewed him last week, he was saying he believes that the Labour Party will actually be worse for Britain now than the Conservatives, because there is no free speech within the Labour Party. If you have a specific line, if you stray from that line, you're suspended and then removed. Even if you're an MP, a Labour MP, they have very little freedom of speech, very little wriggle room. And of course, if you've got a party like that that's so rigidly controlled, then anything can happen. That you just don't know where that party's going to go, and it's very unlike the British to be behaving like that. So that's why I'm very concerned about the way things are going with the general election next year here in Britain, because it looks as if the Conservatives don't want to actually win the general election. I've heard from some inside sources that they actually want to lose because they know the economy is going to crash, and they would much rather that happened whilst Labour are in power than them, so that Labour gets the blame. This is how cynical I think politics is here now, and so really the people ruling the roost are the big corporations, as I said before. They're the ones who are actually calling the shots, I think, and the government is constantly on the back foot, and the people are almost totally forgotten about, where you've got a parliament, most of which of the ruling party and the opposition are simply beholden to the big corporations. So no, I'm afraid the prospects are pretty grim. The positive thing about that, though, is that maybe the country will run out of money to help the Ukrainians. And I think there is some sort of change of attitude there, certainly in the United States and more in Britain too, where people are getting rather fed up with the idea of supporting the Ukrainians. There's certainly no stomach within the British and in the forces for taking the Russians on, because they know that if they take the Russians on directly, that the British will lose. So there may be a bit of rolling back on the support for Ukraine, I hope.
Well, Steve, what do you think? I mean, what Tony is saying is basically that the big corporations are ruling. So what would the British people have to do to actually get control of their country again? I mean, it's the same situation that so many of these Western nations are facing today, that the power is actually in the hands of a few. And the majority of people do not support a lot of the policies that these governments are doing. So what does it take in your perspective?
Well, frankly, I'm very pessimistic about what it takes ever actually happening. But fundamentally, we have to realize that neoliberalism and the neoclassical economics on which it's based are a completely false analysis of both human society and a capitalist economy. So we're following a theory which is wrong. If you do what a wrong theory tells you to do, you're bound to make things worse than if you simply STFU and did nothing at all. So in this sense, government policy is actually making capitalism work worse than it would do if they weren't actually trying to manage it, following this false theory. So that's what's necessary. But, we've had 40 years of this, and it's slowly dawning on people that it hasn't worked. But over 40 years, you've lost your manufacturing sector, you've lost your higher education sector in terms of access to people who aren't wealthy, you've lost your health service, et cetera, et cetera. You've got an enormous amount of rebuilding to do. So even if the realization did come that this was a terribly bad way to run an economy, it's been running it for 40 years and it's done a terrible amount of damage, which probably will never be reversed.
Oh my goodness. Well, that is definitely sad the way you've just said it, Steve. But Tony, what do you think? I mean, is it likely that the situation just will continue to deteriorate, that we would see more widespread strikes or perhaps even more aggressive actions taken by the people? At the end of the day, as we believe, the real power is in the hands of the people if they're united and are working towards a goal. I mean, how do you see it?
Well, okay, so I'm a bit more optimistic than Steve. I mean, certainly when it comes to the general election next year, bad. But after that, the thing is that the Jeremy Corbyn factor in Britain was really fascinating to watch. And of course, although the right would like to think, and the neoliberals would like to think that's all gone, Peter Mandelson and Keir Starmer and the rest of them, who are really, and Tony Blair, by the way, who are behind the Starmer project to take over the Labour Party. What we may well see, I think, because there's so many people on the left, the former Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, obviously Corbyn himself, Chris Williamson, George Galloway, various of these other ex-Labour characters are getting their act together. And we saw this on the right. We saw this with the Tories and Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party. What can happen in this country, and I think probably will, is that you get a collection of a very strong amongst the public, but not maybe very powerful in Westminster, fringe party, which can move things in their direction. So I think this is actually what's likely to happen when Starmer gets to power, as I think he will next year, and proves to be so utterly useless as he quite clearly is going to be, and actually quite dangerous. Then I think that is the moment at which the left will kind of re-Corbynize itself and start to push. It won't have parliamentary seats, but what it will have is a tremendous amount of sympathy, both across the left and the right. Believe it or not, a lot of Tories support these Corbynistic, the QE for the people. In other words, creating money and just giving it to people to spend to get the economy going. These kinds of policies are just common sense, and also renationalising a lot of the things that Thatcher sold off. These are very popular right across the board. So I think that's where the most important hopes lie. And this, of course, is where many of the bankers and security services are trying to infiltrate and control these groups, which may rise up in the next couple of years.
Okay. And on that note, I appreciate both of you being with me on the spotlight. We're out of time. Steve Kien, economist and author out of Amsterdam. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Margaret Thatcher, signing off for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time.